Today we're going to be picking back up and beginning to finish out the last leg of our sermon in the book of Acts. And so I'd like to ask you guys, if you have a Bible with you, feel free to turn it to Acts chapter 25. If you don't have a Bible with you, then you can grab one from the seat right in front of you. It'll look just like mine. And if you grab that, then you can turn to page 1120, as you can see on the screen, and that'll get you right where you're going. Now, we've been making progress through the book of Acts, and we had gotten 24 chapters deep, and then mysteriously we stopped. This thing called Christmas happened, you guys might recall. For some reason, the story of the Apostle Paul at the end of Acts didn't directly relate back to the birth of Jesus, so we decided we'd better change things up a little bit. So in the month of January here, we will finish out the end of this message series. I just want to give you a reminder, though, of where the Apostle Paul finds himself as this story is winding down. But I also want to share a brief personal story that relates to the passage. So, as we saw in chapter 24 and 23 before it, the Apostle Paul had finished his third missionary journey. And once he had completed that journey, he went back to Jerusalem. Part of this is that the Apostle Paul had a large sum of money that he collected from all over Europe, modern-day Europe, where he'd been on his missionary journey. And he took that money and gave it to the church, which was in desperate need due to a famine that is recorded inside and outside of the Bible as taking place in Judea during this time. So Paul brought the benevolence there, and while he was there as a devout Christian, but also a devout Jew, as Paul would have perceived himself, Paul wanted to go to the temple and to make sacrifices there and to go be present there and worship God. And so Paul made that journey. He actually paid for other men to complete their fast with him, which was an honorable thing to do. And as he got into the temple, a false accusation was launched against him. He was accused by Jewish believers out of the province of Asia, which was the last place that Paul went and really heavily evangelized. He was accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple, which would have been a sacrilegious thing to do. Paul hadn't committed this crime, but nonetheless the crowd got stirred up into a rage, and they were just about to kill him. He was rescued by Roman officials, and then the Roman military leader of the area put him on trial and couldn't figure out whether to prosecute him or not, so he passed him off to his boss, who was the governor of Rome. And that man, a man by the name of Felix, put Paul on trial too. He couldn't find a good reason to execute Paul like the Jewish leadership wanted, and so he decided instead, we'll just keep him here and hope he can pay me a bribe to let him go. And so for 2 years' time, Paul has stayed locked up under arrest in the palace of Felix in the city of Caesarea. And no doubt during that time, Paul is hoping that justice will eventually happen and that he'll be set free, but he's not willing to grease Felix's palms and pay him money in order to be set free. And so he doesn't play into all of that. Nonetheless, Paul is stuck there for 2 years, and we find out just at the end of chapter 24 that as that passage concludes, Felix has now been replaced, and there is a new governor coming in by the name of Festus. Now, Festus has a reputation, actually, for being a decent ruler in the ancient world, and part of why we know that is because we hear mention of him, but not a lot of mention of him, and typically it's scandal that gets you heard about as a politician. So, for the 2 years or so that he's in this position, he seems to do an okay job. But as we'll see today, the handling of Paul's case and the accusations against him leave some things to be desired. So I have a question for you. When was the first time that you were involved in some sort of court hearing? When was the first time that you had to appear before a judge? Or have you ever been to a court and had that happen? I was thinking about that earlier this week, and I couldn't help but think of a time in high school. And when a friend and I was 16 years old, I think it was just before I became a Christian, and I was driving home with a friend named Isaac. He was coming out to our family's ranch, and our family's ranch in Ontario was about 20 minutes out of town. And so we went that journey, and we took some back roads to go there. And as we were driving along, we drove by a small trailer park that was there at the edge of town. And when we came up to it, there was this Ford Explorer that was in front of us. And we were just in my little 1988 Chevy Beretta. That car required a lot of prayer to keep running. But we got behind this Ford Explorer, and the Explorer began acting very weird. He would slow down almost to a stop, no turn signal on, and then he'd go 20 feet and then slow down and almost stop, and then go 10 feet and slow down and almost stop. And Isaac and I were behind him, and we're thinking, what is going on here? I don't get what this guy's doing. And again, we were discussing with each other, there's no turn signal. I don't know, is he wanting to turn? Is he going to turn? Is he just having mechanical trouble? And so we decided, let's just hit the gas. We'll get around this guy. and we'll continue on with our journey. So we hit the gas and we start to pass the Explorer, and as we do, he starts to turn into us, and he almost hits the back of our car as we're passing him. And so we thought, whoa, man, we almost got hit. That's crazy, especially where 2/3 of our car was in front of him by the time he was turning towards us. And so we drove on, and moments later, that Explorer appeared behind us, wailing on the horn and flashing his lights and trying to wave us off the road. And it didn't seem like a terribly comforting idea to stop and see what the guy wanted. So we decided we'll continue on. So we sped up, and he sped up. And pretty soon we were doing 90 miles an hour down the road, and this Explorer is still honking and blinking his lights and trying to get us to pull over. And we go another probably 4 or 5 miles. And finally I realized, if I keep going, this guy's going to know where I live, and I don't know what his intentions are, but I'm not thinking they're very good. I have no idea why he's thinking he can run me off the road. And he's even pulling up beside me as we're driving, like he's thinking of pit maneuvering me or something. And so finally we decided we're just going to stop. We'll stop. And actually there was a neighbor of ours a couple miles away who was the local high school guidance counselor. And I thought, well, at least we'll be near somebody friendly if something goes awry. And there'll be somebody to identify the bodies. But so we slow down, and we're doing about 20 miles an hour, and I'm thinking, maybe this guy will finally pass us. He pulls up next to us, pulls out in front of us, and wedges his Explorer right in front of our car, like he's trying to stop us. Now we're thinking like, okay, I don't know what comes next. I guess we'll wait and see. And my buddy Isaac said, Lloyd, you better just gun it and run this guy over. And I don't know. And I was thinking about it, to be frank. But the guy gets out, and it's this 25 or so year old guy. He's got this leather jacket on and this really cocky smirk, and he walks back to our car, and he wags his finger at us like this. And we're thinking, what on earth is going on? And then the guy reaches into his coat, and now we're thinking, we're going to get shot. We're going to die today. And I was getting ready to duck down and gun the car. He reaches out, pulls out his phone. Now this is the olden days when they were flip phones and smartphones. So, but he pulls out his flip phone, and he pushes 4 buttons. Now, of course, back in the olden days, you had to type in the number and then hit send. So 4 buttons in my mind meant he must be calling the police. We waited a second. He stood there, staring us down. We waited a minute more, and finally we decided, I'm tired of this game. And so he was out of the vehicle. We gunned the car, went around him, drove home. And when I got home, I told my father what happened, and Isaac recounted it as well. And my father called the local sheriff's department to tell them what had gone on. They said, oh, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. They said, we had this guy call us up, and he called us and told us that somebody had illegally passed him, and that he wanted us to come out and arrest him. So apparently he had gotten in his mind that this was a good idea. We'll come out. This guy illegally passed me. He said he used his turn signal. Neither Isaac or I saw it, but whatever. And so that prompted our first occasion to go to court. I remember I was nervous about it. I was 16, but my dad said, we can't just let this lay. This guy's kind of a loose cannon, so we're going to go before a judge and talk about this. And we went before the judge a few weeks later, and I remember being super nervous there. I'd already been interviewed by the police and all of that, and I sat down, and the judge ended up giving this guy like 50 hours of community service and an anger management class. So it all ended with an okay ending, all things considered. But that was my first time in front of a judge, and I have to say, it can be scary to be in that position, right, where you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if you're going to get in trouble or if the other person is going to get in trouble. And oftentimes in our lives, we're going to face situations where we might find ourselves in that position. We have to make a decision about whether to be involved in some sort of court battle or not, or whether we should make a decision or not. And I think as Christians especially, sometimes this can be a conflicting thing. We hear a variety of things in the Bible. I mean, Jesus tells us, especially in context when we're having issues with another believer, that if we have something that would bring us to court, that we ought to go talk to them in advance and try to straighten it out beforehand, in part because it's an embarrassment to the church if we can't do that. In fact, Paul even suggests in Corinthians that it might be better if the church leadership wades into it and helps them figure out how to resolve the conflict so that it doesn't become a big public debacle. But there's this big decision that has to be made. In the case of the Apostle Paul today, here he is. He's about to have what amounts to his 4th trial, and he's going to have to make some decisions about what he does about that and how he responds to it. I think we can learn some things from it, and even some principles of how we should live our life. So let's go ahead and turn to that passage in Acts chapter 25. We're going to break this down into 4 different sections, beginning with verses 1 through 5. Before we begin reading, though, let's just take a moment and come before the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to gather here and to study your word. Lord, I pray that you would move in our hearts and that you would draw us nearer to you. Thank you for this opportunity we have to understand you better. Lord, I don't know where everybody's life is this week as we begin this new year, but I pray for each of us you'd be at work in it. And in this time, you draw us closer to you. We pray these things in Jesus Christ's name and merit, Lord. Amen. Okay. All right, let's begin. Chapter 25, verses 1 through 5. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held in Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, you can press charge against him there. 2 years of waiting for Paul. 2 years of waiting, hoping that finally Felix would be honest about it and let him off the hook for the crime he didn't commit. And it doesn't happen. And now we have a new leader who steps in and who's in this position. And sadly for Paul doesn't even get a chance to talk to him about the situation. Instead, this leader, Festus, goes to Jerusalem and begins having conversations with the Jewish leadership there. And so Festus makes this journey, and it's shrewd politically for Festus to go to Jerusalem right off the bat, because as you may recall, Caesarea is the Roman government's capital city of this area. However, Jerusalem is the cultural center of it, and the people that Festus, as a governor, is going to have to work to keep happy are largely located in Jerusalem. So just a few days into his administration, leading as governor of this region, he goes to Jerusalem, he goes and shakes hands with the most powerful and influential people he can find. And interestingly, the first thing they say is, hey, if you want to be our friend, if you really want to be close to us, you know what you could do? You could kill that guy. This Paul guy over here. You could get rid of him. We would love to have him gone. And Festus is walking into this situation blind. He really doesn't know what Paul has done or what he's guilty or not guilty of. And to his credit, he doesn't immediately cave and say, yeah, I'll send him to you guys and you can do whatever you want. Instead, he says, I have no idea what the situation is, but I'm going to be here for a few days and then I'm going to go back to Caesarea. That's where he's at anyhow. So why don't you get some of your influential people here who want to make a case against him, and they can even be escorted by him from here to there. And an implication of this is that his protective detail, his soldiers who are with him, will keep those people safe in their travels, and they can go along, and when they get to Caesarea, they can launch their criminal case against Paul and try to get him convicted. Now, as we find out in the passage, as Luke writes this gospel, he's found out from people contemporaneous to that time that, in fact, it wasn't just a motive of wanting to put Paul on trial, but even more than that. The local Jewish leadership knew that they couldn't launch an attack to go take over the palace in Caesarea, and that they'd have a hard time killing him under Roman protection once he got to Jerusalem. But if Paul was in transit between the two, and they got together a big group of guys, they could probably assassinate Paul while he was in transit, kill him, and then remove their problem. They'd get what they wanted in the end anyway. Fortunately, Festus doesn't make that decision. He's a little more conservative about it, wants to actually hear out what's going on, and then make a decision from there. But this is a powerful point for the Jewish leadership to be asking for this, because this really is their first interaction, and it's going to be in Festus' best interest to try to keep these people happy. If there's constant civil unrest in Judea, or heaven help, a civil war or something like that that breaks out, then Festus will likely lose his head for it. He's likely going to be the one the emperor holds accountable. So when he, as his first act of business in office, is offered this chance to, hey, we'll love you, all you have to do is kill that guy, there's got to be some temptation to it while he's facing it. All right, let's continue onward. And And we'll now read verses 6 through 12. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day, he convened the court in order that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Then Paul made his defense. I've done nothing wrong against the Jewish law, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges?" Paul answered, "I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, "You have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you will go." All right, so the Jewish leaders come into Herod's court. Herod, as his, in effect, first act in office, sits up on the judgment seat of the court in Caesarea. This is the highest court in the land of Judea. The only thing short of this is going to the emperor itself, as we'll find out in a moment. And so now Paul is once again being put on trial. And we're told that the Jewish people bring all kinds of accusations against him, although it doesn't tell us precisely what they are. We can, however, tell from Paul's response roughly what the nature of some of those accusations are, because Paul in his defense, or in the one-sentence synopsis of his defense, says, first of all, I haven't violated the Jewish law. And the Jewish law, it's good to note, is not just the law as written by Moses, but it's the law that by and large is actually governing the nation of Israel. So it's their civil law and their religious law. So in effect, it's like Paul saying, I haven't broken any of the local laws. I haven't done anything wrong there. He says, I haven't done anything wrong in the temple. We know he'd already been accused of bringing people into the temple that he shouldn't have. But in effect, Paul's saying, religiously, spiritually, I haven't done anything wrong. And even beyond that, Paul says, I haven't done anything wrong with regards to Caesar, which must mean that one of the accusations launched against him was that he was trying hard to undermine Caesar himself. Now, in our era, if it was said, somebody said something disrespectful about the president, but that would just be kind of par for the course, I suppose. But it wouldn't have been what it was in the ancient world. It's in the ancient world, simply speaking ill of a leader was enough for that leader to have him killed. And in fact, for Festus, if the Caesar ever found out that Festus had a group of people who were constantly talking about how they needed to overthrow Caesar or they needed to undermine Caesar, and he didn't do anything about it, he could potentially lose his own head over it. So it's a serious accusation, and it's potentially a capital offense to have been accused of it. But for Paul's part, he says, I haven't done any of it, and they haven't proved I've done any of it. Festus's response is to turn to him and hoping that he can gain favor with the Jewish leadership. He says, well, why don't we get you and we'll go down there with them and they can hold a different trial down there for you, down in Jerusalem. And Paul's response is pretty to the point on this. He must be getting a little bit frustrated. 2 years locked up for a crime he hasn't committed, stuck in the palace, and now he's being told, hey, we'd like to just go ahead and send you and let your enemies decide whether you're guilty or not. Does that sound like a good plan? So Paul's response in brief is to tell them, right now I'm standing in Caesar's judgment seat. In other words, I'm in the highest court of the land. There's no other place I should be going. And he says, I'm here, and he even makes an accusation in this to Festus. He says, you know darn well that I'm innocent. You know I haven't done anything. And so after that, Paul says, I'm going to make my appeal to Caesar. Now, an appeal to Caesar was a right that you could only have if you were a Roman citizen. And around this time, it's estimated that only about 1 in 15 people were Roman citizens, so a very small minority of the population. However, if you were in this position, and if you were facing a high crime that you were accused of, and especially if the accusation regarding that high crime were a little bit uncertain in terms of how it would be enforced. Maybe it's a weird version of the crime and we're not quite sure how to enforce it, but especially then, it was well within your rights to demand an audience before Caesar. So you couldn't use this for your traffic violation. If you were racing around with your chariot too fast, you couldn't go and say, I want to get rid of my speeding ticket. Not so much. You can't appeal that to Caesar. You're just going to have to pay it. But if it comes to, in this case, this guy has tried to undermine this nation. He's spoken ill of Caesar himself. Well, that's a capital crime. And now Paul is saying, what I want is to just go ahead and be heard by Caesar. I'm tired of this game. Now, it's intriguing to see Festus's response, because Festus, of course, doesn't immediately come right out and say, sure, go ahead, whatever you want, Paul. And Festus actually has a decision to make. He could deny Paul this right if he didn't think that Paul met all of the criteria laid out to appeal to Caesar. Or, as we saw, he can go ahead and allow it. But the first thing he does is he brings all of his wisest counselors and advisors together. He takes a minute for a sidebar, steps off to the side and says, what do we do here, guys? And I'm sure that as they work it out politically, they realize, it might actually be for the best if we get this guy out of here. Because for Festus's part, if he kills Paul, he'll be killing an innocent man. It seems pretty clear. Paul's committed no crime. And so, on the one hand, he could use his authority to murder an innocent man. Or, on the other hand, he could let Paul go, but odds are there's going to be violence coming from the Jewish leadership and from a good part of the Jewish nation if he does that. So that may lead to a rebellion, which puts his life in danger. And so he's kind of trapped in a tough decision. In a sense, Paul has given him a way out of it now. And so now he can say to the Jewish people, guys, I'm sorry, it's out of my hand. I know you leaders wanted this guy killed, but he appealed to Caesar. He's a Roman citizen. I can't do anything about it. We're just going to have to let him go, and Caesar will make his decision. And so, in a sense, he washes his hands of it, and he's able to seemingly move on from there. The challenge that we'll see in a moment that Festus really has is that Festus has deferred this off to somebody else. But what is he going to write in his note to Caesar? This guy was accused of crimes, there was no evidence, but I decided to send him to you anyway. I'm not sure exactly how that note goes. There isn't any credible crime he's been accused of. And so, as we'll see going forward here, Festus now realizes politically it'd be great if I could send him to Caesar, but the downside is I don't have any good reason to send him to Caesar. I can't even prove he's committed any sort of crime, which of course in reality means he should just let Paul go. But he's unwilling to exercise the integrity to do that. So the situation advances from there, and it won't be until next week as we read the next chapter that we'll see the full culmination of this. But let's continue on now and read verses 13 through 22. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respect to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but I convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar." Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear this man." He replied, "Tomorrow you'll hear him." Now, we have the arrival of two interesting biblical characters that we see frequently mentioned outside of the Bible, Herod Agrippa and his sister, Bernice. And it doesn't tell us that role because Luke, writing to his audience, would expect they would know exactly who this is. And so we have Herod. Now, it's good to know we hear about a lot of different Herods in the course of the Bible. And there's Herod the Great, who is grandfather to this Herod. And he's the one who is alive when Jesus is born and actually tries to kill Jesus by killing everybody in Bethlehem. And then we have his son, Herod Antipas, who is king during the time that Jesus is executed. So he's actually the one who is involved in that, though it's Pontius Pilate himself who orders that. And then finally, now we have Herod Agrippa. So this is a grandson of Herod. And it's interesting to know, and we'll try to get you some information down the line on this, but the Herod family dynasty is quite fascinating to look into. Herod the Great, actually, before he takes power, watches his parents and most of his family be executed by political rivals. And this family has all kinds of drama where generation to generation they kill several of their children and siblings and all kinds of things like that in order to try to keep their throne secure. This Herod is not short of his scandals either. His sister, in particular, is at the heart of them. And in her younger years, her sister goes and actually marries a local political diplomat. She has a relationship with him for a couple of years, and then she leaves him and returns home to stay with her brother. There was a lot of rumors going around that you can read about in historical accounts outside of the Bible that Herod and his sister were in fact more than just brother and sister, that they were not completely platonic in their relationship. And so that was somewhat scandalous. Interestingly, his sister actually will go on, and years later, after this account takes place, Titus will be ruling over this area, and Titus will eventually become an emperor in Rome, and she'll have a dating relationship with him. Allegedly, according to Josephus, there's actually a point where he considers marrying her, but ultimately decides not to because he rushes back to Rome in order to take over as the new Caesar. So she's going to have a life of great intrigue. These two are here now, and as they arrive, they're probably arriving here in great part because there's this new guy, Festus, who slightly outranks them. He's the governor of the area who reports directly to the emperor. And in the case of Herod, Herod is the new chosen king who effectively the Roman government has chosen to let be in power. And he, in a sense, is continuing on with the tradition of there being a Jewish king, which we see dating back about 1,000 years from this point. Starting with King David, moving forward, there's always been some sort of king in Jerusalem. And the Roman government finds it convenient to keep somebody there like that because they know the local people, they can help collect the local taxes, and they can really be a tool for the Roman government. And that's in effect what Herod's role is here. Is he's supposed to be an enforcer for the Roman government, but he's slightly outranked by Festus. And because of that, no doubt, he sees this as a great opportunity to come meet the new guy, the guy who's actually got authority over him, wants to come meet his new boss, make friends with him. And when he arrives, Festus basically starts talking to him about one of his pressing problems. In effect, Festus is saying, I've got this guy, and he's accused of this crime, but I actually have no credible accusation against him that I can use. And Festus in that section isn't saying that there were no other accusations. It's just that there was no facts to actually underlay them. The only facts that he could see, or the only things that were factually supported and agreed upon by both parties, was that there was some disagreement about whether Jesus Christ was killed and then raised from the dead, or whether he was killed and still dead. And we can see where the Jewish people, not wanting to legitimize Christianity, would argue against this. For Festus's part, it's not a criminal point. Whether Jesus lived or died, you can't kill Paul for it, or kill the other people. That doesn't make any sense. And then secondly, suppose it was a crime for Jesus to be raised from the dead or not, and somehow Paul was liable for that. Even if that was the case, how would you prove it one way or the other? You'd have to have his body, but this is decades later, so that wouldn't be in good enough shape to ID him. Or you could show that the tomb's empty, well, we got that, but then they might say, well, the body got moved elsewhere, it was stolen. And in fact, that's what Jewish leadership did. So the whole situation's a mess. But Festus sees an opportunity where maybe Herod, who is, although he's only half Jewish ethnically, he's hoping that Herod might be able to give him some insights and help him figure out how to get some sort of letter written to Caesar and make this thing passable in order to get Paul sent on without it looking super conspicuous, because he sent a guy, in effect, to the Supreme Court so his case with no real crime could be heard. All right, so let's read the final section now, at verses 23 through 27. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about it. Therefore, I have brought him before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. We'll stop there for this week. Okay, so a big show happens in effect. And we have all of the local political leadership, all the elite people, the local military officers from this capital city that gather together in this banquet area of the palace where large meetings are held. And once they're all in place, Herod and his sister Bernice are allowed to dramatically enter. They probably come sit somewhere in proximity to the governor. And as they sit down next to Festus, Festus asks that Paul, the prisoner, be brought in. No doubt Paul is in chains, being drugged forward to them as a spectacle. And he tells the audience right up front, glad you're all here today, we got a show for you. Here's this guy. He's been accused by the Jewish people of doing all kinds of terrible things, but I can't find any substantiation of that. And in fact, he says he's innocent. And in a sense, he mischaracterizes what's going on. He says, I found the guy innocent, but he appealed to Caesar, so I'm just going to go ahead and send him that way. Well, that's not exactly what happened, right? He actually was about to send him down to Jerusalem to be tried there by his enemies, even though he knew he was innocent. And now he's sort of changed the story to fit what he wants to. But nonetheless, he tells them what's going on, and he asks King Herod for his audience, for him to explain how we might come up with some sort of credible charge that we can argue one way or the other about. And so with that, Paul, as we'll see next week, is about to have an opportunity to speak to some of the most politically connected people in the empire. But what I want to emphasize here is Paul had to make a tough decision. Really, for 2 years he waited, and had he been willing to do something unjust and bribe an official, he could have potentially got off the hook. But he wasn't willing to do that. Instead, he waited for 2 years, hoping that justice would come. And even when the new guy arrived, and that hope was there, soon it was dashed, and he realized, this gentleman is going to sell me out to my enemies, if that's what's profitable to him. And in that moment, Paul made a decision to go ahead and seek justice. And I think this is interesting because there are arguments within Christianity that we should just allow things to happen and leave ourselves sort of victim to circumstances. Here the Apostle Paul realizes he could be out evangelizing a lot of people. He could be spreading the gospel, and he kind of figures this is his chance to get free. He's been respectful, he's allowed plenty of time, but the corrupt system that he's within is not going to allow him to move forward. And so he makes his appeal to Caesar, and Caesar could find one way or the other. Caesar could execute him based on the accusations or could set him free. And for Caesar, he's in a position of power where he can do it on a whim and no one's going to say anything about it, especially for somebody who is as seemingly insignificant to the empire as the Apostle Paul is. I bring this up because I think that oftentimes in Christianity we have these questions ourselves. And as I said before, if you're in a position where something has legally gone wrong and it's with another Christian, I highly encourage you, as Scripture does, to find any way you can to bring resolution to that. In fact, the book of Proverbs even suggests to Jewish people prior to this time period that if you and your Jewish brother have an argument with each other, it might be better for you to just take the loss than for you to embarrass God by bringing this whole thing up in court and sorting it all out. That said, there comes a point where injustice is reigning and where bad things are happening, and we have a choice about whether to do something about it. And in Paul's case, it's happening pretty systemically. And in those cases, I think we have an obligation to do what Paul does, to use the legal mechanisms that we have to try to bring justice about, to try to bring a legal restoration to it. And you may face situations like this in your own life where you're accused of something, or someone else does something to you, and you have to decide whether to bring charges against them. And I encourage you to be prayerful about that, and to really seek God's will on it and ask Him what you should do. But there is a sense in which I think sometimes we feel like we need to placate people and just let injustice continue on, and that's really not a Christian tenet. In modern Christianity, we can see this in a lot of ways. There are groups like Masterpiece Cake Shop, who made national news in this last couple of years because they refused to bake a cake that had messaging that was pro-homosexual that they didn't agree with, according to their Christian values. Whatever your beliefs may be on that they felt like they shouldn't be forced to do this, and they made a decision, told somebody they wouldn't, and as a result, they were sued. Huge fines were levied against them. Eventually, it went clear up to the Supreme Court, and they were let off the hook. But there are many cases like this where prosecution is being used maliciously against Christians. And they have to decide in that case, do I just pay the fine? Do I just accept it? Certainly, most of the time, that would be the cheaper thing to do, rather than being a drawn-out litigation battle. But is it just? And that question, I think, is one that we need to ask, is what's happening actually going to be just? And for that matter, am I going to be empowering somebody to go use their power to go hurt somebody else because I didn't stand up and do anything about it? Now, I hope most of you don't find yourself in a position of having to face those questions today. Hopefully you're not in a situation where you're in some sort of legal battle and something like that's going on. But I want to encourage you if you do. Here, Paul shows us a good example. He takes his time, he waits 2 years, he's prayerful about it, he waits on God to do something about it. But when it seems like he's about to be thrown before a kangaroo court and killed for a crime he hasn't committed, he's willing to say, I'm appealing this. I'm not just going to accept it. You aren't going to have my enemies be the ones who decide whether I'm a good person or not. That's not really fair. And he pushes it up the line to Caesar. And as we'll see eventually, he'll get his time to answer before Caesar what goes on with that. I want to encourage you to weigh out those decisions heavily, because here we see there is a place for it in Christianity, and actually there's a time where it's probably virtuous for you to seek through legal channels to resolve some of these things. At this time, I'm going to ask Michael to come forward and lead us in our communion and offering meditations. As he does, I'll also ask our deacons to come forward. We're going to serve the elements, and I'll ask you to join me for prayer while that's going on. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we live in a less broken system than Paul did. That injustice isn't as broadly spread. But Father, I pray that as we face these tough situations as Christians sometimes, where it seems like we're being oppressed for what we believe, or where our lives are in danger through following you, or maybe it's just more common stuff that's going on. But I pray that you'd give us wisdom to know what your will is in our life. And Father, if we have friends or loved ones or people that we know that are going through those things too, I pray that you'd give us wisdom to know how to support them and help carry them through those situations. Thank you, Lord, that you're bigger than any earthly circumstance we face. We could see that in Paul's life. He could have been dead 1,000 times over by now. And Lord, we trust you today in our own. We pray this in Jesus Christ's name.